Okay. Further debate? I recognize the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And it is a thrill for me to rise in the House today to talk about housing. And, you know, the government has given us an opportunity to have this debate by tabling Bill 109, More Homes for Everyone Act. And one of the things that it strikes me with this government is, you know, they're not necessarily considering the majority of Ontarians when they write their legislation. You know, Ontario's housing crisis has reached a breaking point. In just 10 years, home prices has risen over 200%, while incomes increased by just 30%. And rapidly increasing prices for ownership are contributing to, of course, rapidly increasing prices for rent. And this is trapping many renters in unsuitable housing and stealing prosperity from everyone left behind through lower disposable incomes at a time when we know that there is rising inflation. So indeed, something needs to be done. The cost of housing has become a major barrier for new Ontarians, for young Ontarians, and for racialized and those very diverse people like those who live in my riding of Scarborough-Guildwood, and those that are economically mobile in establishing their life and their future in Ontario. The cost of rental increases has become a barrier for Ontarians of all ages, including seniors who are on fixed income. You know, I often hear this Ford government crow about record housing starts. Yet, do they ever stop to ask themselves the question, who is benefiting from these housing starts? You know, how much of that is actually going to having affordable housing for young families? How much of it is affordable rental housing? How much of that new housing will meet the needs of families and individuals in my riding of Scarborough-Guildwood? And what I say is, not much. And the sad part is that young people are losing their vision and their hope for a future where they see themselves owning a house. You know, I spoke with my niece, Jada Hunter, and she's a student at Queen's University, and she said, I don't see a future in which I will be able to afford to own a home. It's just out of reach. And I don't think that this is something, Mr. Speaker, that we should allow in Ontario. And I think that one of the major challenges with Bill 109 is that it lacks a vision. It doesn't even meet the consulted on recommendations of the government's own housing panel. Now, we're supposed to believe that somehow there is another plan. Where is it? Why didn't you include it here? There's no help for first-time home buyers in this Bill 109. There's no investment in affordable housing. There's no rental controls. And we remember that it's this PC government that removed the caps on rental housing. There is no zoning reform so that we can fill in with density. We're in the missing middle area. And there's no taxes on developers sitting on a lot of available land. You know, David Crombie and Ann Golden write in an op-ed in the Toronto Star in January that we cannot sprawl our way to housing affordability. Optimizing land already approved for development and building in our existing communities is the most economic strategy to provide the housing that people need and can afford. And, you know, is this government listening? I don't think so. Ontario Liberals will address this crisis once and for all by acting on these priorities. The things that really need to be solved, including speculation and the financialization of housing, rent controls, inclusionary zoning, government-built affordable housing and support for construction, trade, education. Ontario Liberals will address this crisis once and for all, Mr. Speaker. You know, while the government says that the task force report gives them a long-term roadmap, many of its recommendations are not addressed in Bill 109, including changing municipal zoning rules to allow more housing to be built aside from single-family homes, and to really address and arrest that sprawl. And while high housing prices are nothing new in the Greater Toronto Area and beyond, the cost of buying a home just about everywhere in Ontario is soaring. In 2021, the average sale price of homes in the province was 44% higher than 2 years earlier, according to the figures from the Canadian Real Estate Association. And you know, I also want to address some of the specifics around Bill 109, specifically the 90-day window for approvals. It is troubling that this Act financially penalizes municipalities for not approving a development within 90 days. This seems like a very arbitrary number that's been just pulled out. This will slow the development process down, as more developments will end up in the Ontario Land Tribunal, which we know is already labouring under a backlog. It will smother voices of local communities. If a developer is building in a subdivision on underdeveloped land, 90 days might seem reasonable. But what about all of the planning considerations and proposals that are needed for a development with more complexity? Within perhaps a dense urban area or in a sensitive area, maybe for historical reasons, like areas like the Golden Mile in my community in Scarborough. 90 days seems arbitrary, and some might even say that it's irresponsible and causing even more noise and hurdles in a system that we know needs to speed up, but doing it in a way that is careful. David Crombie and Ann Golden also noted that there is, in fact, no shortage of land already designated for development, that municipal plans show that there are approximately 88,000 acres of land within urban boundaries across the region already approved for housing, enough to meet Ontario's provincial growth projections for decades to come. So, in Bill 109, the Ford government's response to these issues has come well short. Implementing arbitrary timelines like this 90-day turnaround just adds more noise to a system that needs actually more response. In my riding of Scarborough-Guildwood, too many young people from Scarborough say that they have given up hope, just like my niece Jada, in living in our community in Scarborough. They just don't see themselves ever owning a home, and some are having trouble even just finding affordable rent. Speaker, this is a housing crisis that we're in, and it requires an urgent and thoughtful response from this government that we just don't see in Bill 109. One resident in my riding of Scarborough-Guildwood noted that in Bendale, a bungalow purchased in 2014 for $400,000 is now worth over 3 times that amount. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. That's without an increase in income to cover that. That's without any new supply coming into that system. The residents in my community see it, and they know that something needs to be done. In my constituency office, housing and housing affordability, access to affordable housing, we've already heard from the opposition's debate about the 23,000-person backlog that's waiting for affordable home ownership. I want to speak to that, because housing affordability means that you're not spending more than 30% of your income just to stay housed. Well, how many people are actually living within that framework today? When you think about it, people are spending 40, 50, maybe even more than half of their income just to stay housed. And where does that leave them? How do they buy food? Mr. Speaker, that leaves them lining up at the food banks. Food banks are on the rise in Scarborough. We just opened one in our community. And in fact, we're expanding them. And we're doing that because people just don't have enough income and funds to keep themselves housed and fed at the same time. And in a province as vast and as wealthy and capable as Ontario, we need to do better. And so, I would urge the government to take the time. That's what debate is for today. It's to point out what needs to be improved. I would urge the government to take the time, listen to your own task force recommendations, and look at the ways in which you can boost the supply of housing, not just single-family, very costly housing, but actual affordable housing that families and individuals need in this province and deserve, because housing in Canada is a human right. Every person has the right to have access to a roof over their head. And so it is incumbent on us as legislators, as individuals that are responsible for setting the rules, to ensure that that includes everyone, not just the wealthy who can afford to seize and hold those properties and not make them available for so many people who are in desperate need of affordable housing. So I want to thank everyone for this opportunity to talk about one of my passions, which is affordable housing. And thanks so much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Questions and comments? I recognize the member from, Perry Sound, Muskoka. I apologize, sir.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the member from Scarborough-Guildwood for her speech on this bill. And I heard her in the midst of the speech talk about what kinds of houses are being built. Of course, the government introduced the More Homes, More Choices Act, and I can say from experience in my own riding, having the minister up to do a groundbreaking last June, that to all types of housing, but particularly purpose-built rental housing is being built. In the town of Gravenhurst, the minister did the groundbreaking for Talisman Great, 236 rental units. That's the largest purpose-built rental development in Muskoka in its history. So this is working, and it's building the kinds of housing that is needed. So why does the opposition want us to stop building this housing that is so much needed across the province?
Response, the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. There is a housing crisis in Ontario, in Canada, and this government is missing the opportunity. They have not focused on keeping people housed. Even during the pandemic, we saw where BC gave renters a $500 amount that they could use to cover their rents and keep themselves securely housed in the midst of a global pandemic. Ontario did nothing for renters. They did absolutely nothing for renters, and even those who are small landlords, just no acknowledgement that there's a role for the provincial government in building more supply of affordable rental and affordable housing in this province. It's a shame.
Next question, the member from Toronto St. Paul's.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the member from Scarborough-Guildwood. I appreciate you, trying to stand and speak in support of your constituents with regards to social housing. However, I do know that in the previous Liberal government, we saw cuts of approximately $150 million or so from social housing that were in fact corporate tax cuts, like they were to help corporations with tax cuts. So I guess I know hindsight is 20/20. I'm just wondering, this bill put forth by this Conservative government, do you see any inroads in this government's bill for affordability for your residents in Scarborough-Guildwood? Thank you.
Response, the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you so much for that question, and that's where I believe that this bill falls well short. It does not look at the housing crisis from the lens of affordability and those who are in such desperate need of affordable housing, and so This is a crisis in Ontario. People are in situations in my community in Scarborough where they just are underhoused. So there's larger families in not enough adequate housing, and it's because we don't have the supply. Under the former Liberal government, we actually built and helped municipalities to build affordable housing and to put more units into circulation so that we can address that issue of affordable housing supply. There is nothing here that speaks to that, and it does not do anything to help those families that I mentioned in Scarborough that are choosing between housing and rent and food.
Thank you. Next question. I recognize the member from Oakville.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. It sounds like all of us in the legislature understand there's a housing crisis. So I think that's step one. I think we all acknowledge that. However, as my colleague from Parry Sound Muskoka pointed out, you didn't support the previous bill, More Homes, More Choice, which has led to the largest build of rental apartments and units in the province in 30 years. And I'm not sure if you're going to support this bill or not, but you did mention in your speech that there was a backlog with the Ontario Land Tribunal. This bill specifically is investing $19 million to invest in the Ontario Land Tribunal and the Landlord-Tenant Board so that we can get through the backlog much quicker. So that's exactly what we're doing, is what you said is a problem in your speech. So will you join us and help reduce that backlog?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Response, the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the reasons why the Landlord and Tenant Board, has such a backlog now, it's because this government ignored the needs of renters in their previous legislation. You made it much more precarious for renters, and that's why there's been a rise and an increase in the backlog. As I mentioned, there was no help for renters to stay securely housed during the midst of the global pandemic. One of the first cuts that you made under your government, under Doug Ford's government, was to cut rent controls. The median rent costs have gone up over 11% in 1 year after this government lifted rent control. So Bill 109 does nothing to address this concern for renters in Scarborough, and there's no help, as I said, for those who are looking for affordable housing.
Next question, member from York South-Weston.
Thank you, Speaker, and thanks to the member from Scarborough-Guildwood for her comments. I know that the Toronto City spends $800 million for housing, and this government spends only $6 million for last year alone. And I know that your government, previous government, has also downloaded the responsibility for housing and housing affordability issues. What can we improve this with your experience now? Both this government and the previous government had let down and created the housing crisis. How can we now join us and support our housing plan?
Thank you. Response, the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you for asking, the member from York South-Weston. Because, this downloading that occurred under the Mike Harris government is really what destroyed the affordable housing system in Ontario, and specifically, I see that in certainly when we look at the number of units. We look at the state of the units. They downloaded the responsibility onto the backs of municipalities under the Harris government with no funding for maintenance of those units. No funding. So this is, this is what has contributed to the housing crisis in Ontario, and the fact that the Ford government has refused to spend on housing, on building affordable housing, on any sort of program to help to address that is really a shame.
Thank you. A quick back and forth. Next question. I recognize the member from Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry.
Thank you, Speaker. It kind of grows on you once you say it a couple of times. The question of the member office, you talked about, of course, you blamed Mike Harris for downloading, and I'm just wondering, now, now wait a second. Now, your party there was for 15 years, and you went through the who did what study, and I remember working with then Minister Watson on it. A couple of promises were made throughout that study that, of course, didn't come through. But if after 2 years, or I think it was 2.5 years of conducting that study, but what services should be funded from the provincial level and what from the lower level, and your party endorsed the changes that Harris had made, I'm assuming because they made no changes. So I'm not sure how you can sit there and talk about the housing issue being a result of former...
Thank you. Thank you. Response, the member from Scarborough-Guildwood.
Yeah, we were busy. We were busy addressing the education that under the former Harris government, cuts to education. Only 2/3 of Ontario students were graduating under Harris. So we had to bring that way up. I believe it was close to 90% of students that were graduating when we left office. We also had to fix issues, in Ontario Works and ODSP that Harris also downloaded on the backs of municipalities. And, we had to re-upload and take that responsibility. So there were a number of systems that were destroyed under the Conservatives, under Harris, and that your party continued to do those cuts to critical systems.
Thank you very much.